Thank you everyone for having me today. This is a really fun session, I think, because it starts to intermingle in a lot of the different Power Platform tools. And I've kind of become a little bit of a evangelist myself in getting folks that are either focused on Power BI or maybe focused in Power Apps and Flow, and really showing you how these tools work really well together. And so that's what today's session is about, showing how Microsoft Flow in this case can work really well with Power BI. I assume many of the folks in the session today are maybe Power BI focused, but I want to show you how other tools can intermingle in with Power BI to make it work even better. And in this case, we're going to be looking at how you can actually have live streaming data sets, send in data into Power BI using Microsoft Flow. So we're going to walk you through how to set up a flow and then how to set up a streaming data set with Power BI and how they can kind of work together. And we're going to make the session pretty interactive. So we got kind of inching up towards 80 or so folks, and hopefully more as we keep going. As we go through the session, I'm going to actually ask for your interaction at some certain points where I'll have you do a survey, and we'll actually look at that survey data being streamed into Power BI as we go through the session. And we'll do a few other things in here that will hopefully make it a little interactive. Real briefly about myself, if you're not familiar with who I am, my name is Devin Knight. I'm the president of Pragmatic Works Training. So I focus on creating new training content all around SQL Server, BI, Azure, Power Platform, everything from A to Z there. When it comes to working with data and Microsoft products, we probably have a training class for it. I'm also a Microsoft Data Platform MVP. If you don't know what that is, it just means I've been recognized for evangelizing Microsoft products over time. I've also authored seven books, the latest of which came out last October was a Power BI book. And then I blog at a website called devinknightsql.com. I blog quite a bit about Power BI. I usually have posts about what's new with Power BI, and I do a lot of video-based blogging as well, just to make it, frankly, I do the video-based blogging because I'm a little too lazy to write it all out. So I like to do videos, and I'll do a little writing that go along with them to help have some context around it as well. If you're a Twitter person, you can see my Twitter account there, and you can also email me later if you have any questions. I think Michael might have mentioned it, but you can also see in the handout section of the GoToMeeting my slide deck. So if you want the slide deck later, it's available in the GoToMeeting. All right, so again, our purpose of today's session is to talk about streaming data sets into Power BI. So if you're brand new to this concept, the purpose here is to give your users the ability to look at real-time results in your dashboards in Power BI. So there's a lot of different scenarios where it may make sense to use streaming data sets. It might be that you want to stream in social media data as it's occurring. So I don't know if you follow any specific social media brands, perhaps. I know one big one in the United States is Wendy's. Wendy's, the hamburger company, does a lot of social media interaction with not only their customers, but also other brands. And they troll other brands a little bit, but they're kind of known for being funny about how they work with Twitter and other social media accounts. And maybe you work for a brand and you want to be much more interactive through your social media interaction. And you want to know every time someone tweets or mentions something about your company. Well, you can actually do that. You can use Flow to create a trigger to watch any tweets that are mentioned about your company. And as your company is brought up, you can actually stream that data live into Power BI. Of course, it makes sense to do that because social media is a very kind of instantaneous thing. You want to be able to react as instantly as possible or as quickly as possible. And so it makes sense that would be a streaming data set. You can get that information in right away. Other things where it might make sense is maybe you're working with an IoT device. So maybe many of you probably have walked down the freezer section of a grocery store, and you've noticed as you walk through the freezer section, all the lights turn on in the freezer section because it senses that you're going by. Well, a lot of those companies use IoT devices to actually look at how often that occurs and be able to track how often that occurs, so they have some idea of resource allocation. Hey, we had this number of people walking through this part of the store at this part of the day, so we know that we need to increase the number of employees during this time frame, or at least the number of employees in this section during that time frame. So there's a lot of things that you could do to make it really relevant to have real-time data, and where real-time data can be important. And using the streaming data set concept here can make that obtainable. So there are three different forms of streaming data sets within inside of Power BI. You have push data sets, which is what you'll see here called API. You have streaming data sets, which is all around stream analytics within Azure. And then you have PubNub data sets, which is kind of a third-party add-in feature And what that one allows you to do is you can tap into some free and some paid subscriptions for APIs. So they have some interesting ones out there you can kind of take a look at, and they're not that difficult to connect to, but it allows you to stream in data from their APIs that they've provided to you. Now, the one that we're going to focus of these three is the push data set or the API data set. And the reason why we're going to focus on that one for the time being is there's a lot of benefits to using the push data set as opposed to the other two. Some of the benefits are, one, it can actually track data historically a lot better. Two, you can create any kind of report visuals you want on top of push data sets, whereas streaming data sets and PubNub data sets are limited to only certain visuals within a dashboard. And then in addition, like I mentioned, you want to be able to track data historically. I actually want to see data over time and how that data has changed. Well, it'll actually create, using a push data set with the API connector, it'll allow you to track data historically. There's a little option where you can turn on historical data retention, and that allows you to store data historically. Now, there is a limit to that. The data limit is, I believe, if I remember right, is it stores about roughly 5 million rows, depending on how many columns you have and things like that. So there's some limits on the number of columns you can have. I believe, if I remember right, it was about 75 columns you can have. But hopefully you don't have a data set, one simple streaming data set that has a ton more than that. So there's some benefits here. Again, the push data set allows you to create any kind of report visual you want, whereas the other two options do not. And you can then also track it historically. And it does create a database behind the scenes, but it's not really a database that you have visibility into. So you can't actually go then connect directly to that database. That's not an option. It's kind of behind the scenes there for you. All right, so the first thing I want to do is walk you through how to create a streaming data set in Power BI. And then our next steps, what we're going to do is walk you through how to create a flow, if you've never done that before, how to create a flow in Power BI to be able to then push data into Power BI. Excuse me, I think I said Power BI a moment ago. We're going to create a flow in Flow, Microsoft Flow, and then that flow is going to push data into Power BI. All right, so our first step here is all around creating a streaming data set. So let me bring in my web browser here connected to Power BI. I create a special workspace just for our meeting today. And what I like to do is in this workspace, it's completely new, it's completely blank. I haven't done anything in this workspace yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new streaming data set. And you can find the location where you can create new streaming data sets up in the top section right here where it says create. If I were to select that, it gives you an option here where you can then tell it that you want to create a new report, dashboard, data set, streaming data set, or data flow. In our case here, we're going to create a new streaming data set, so I'll select that option. And then we talked about these three different options you have a few moments ago in the slide deck. We mentioned that there's several limitations to using the Azure Stream Analytics or the PubNub, but the API connection, the push data set, is very flexible as far as the type of connections you can look at, the type of visuals you can look at, I should say, and the historical nature of storing the data. So we're going to select the push data set, the API option here, and hit next. And then we're going to give the data set a name. So in this case, what I'm going to have you guys do to interact with this part of the class is I'm going to have you actually send data into a survey that I have. And so inside of that survey, I have a few questions that I'm going to ask you. And the things that I want to ask are, what are some of the skills that you're most interested in learning about? What's your experience in the skill that you selected as your most important one? And then your location, where are you from? And so what I want to do is I'm going to create columns in the data set that I'm going to be pushing information into in Power BI. I'm going to create some columns and then give it a data set name. So that way I have some way of receiving that information from Flow. All right, so let's give it a name. I'm going to go ahead and call this my streaming survey. I'll zoom in on this and ideally spell correctly. There we go. And we're going to add in some new columns. So we'll add in some new values or columns here. So the first column I'm going to have in here is the skill that you're most interested in learning. Okay, and that's going to be a text field. And by the way, you will notice there's an option a little bit lower here. If I scroll down just a bit, you will notice there's an option here that we do want to go ahead and turn on called historical data analysis. I'm going to flip that on because we want to track historically the options that people select. And so the first question I'm going to ask you is, what kind of skill are you most interested in? The second question I'm going to ask is, what's your experience in that skill that you select that you're most interested in learning? So are you new to it? Are you already kind of intermediate, but you want to learn more about it, or whatever? And then finally, I want to know the location that you live in. So tell me, what location are you from? So kind of city, state, or city, province, or whatever it may be. But basically tell me where you're from. All right, so I've created 3 different columns in this data set. They're all text columns. And if I'm happy with the columns that I've created, I'll just hit create here. And this will save this new streaming data set called streaming survey. And when you hit done, you can find that streaming data set either underneath the datasets section here, or you can also find it over in the left-hand side underneath the datasets section of the workspace. Okay, so with that done, we can now start to build reports on top of that dataset. Even though we don't have any data being pushed into it yet, I want to go ahead and create kind of a skeleton of what a report will look like. So there won't be any data in it yet, but I want to do that because what I'm going to do is actually have you guys start to input data into my survey live. And I want to start with no data and start to see information streamed into it as you actually do my survey questions. All right, so I'm going to hit create a report. And we're going to create, again, a skeleton of a report here. It's not going to actually have a ton of functionality to it yet until we actually deploy this off, or until we actually create the flow. But for this initial section here, what I'd like to do is we're going to create a report with maybe a basic table where we can actually see some of the data coming in. So I'm going to create a table and go ahead and throw in the columns that I have, like so. And we'll increase the size of this, just so it's a lot easier to see. Perfect. And again, there's no data yet, but that will change. And then I'd also like to bring in here maybe a map so I can see where you're from. If I'm going to ask what your location is, maybe I should actually bring that into a map. So I'm going to create a map with a location, and then I also want to see maybe just a count of how many individuals respond to it so I know where people are from. All right, that looks good. We'll go ahead and bring that over here. And then finally, we'll bring in one more visual here, maybe 2 more. I want to bring in a column chart. So I'm going to bring in a column chart here. And in this column chart, what I'd like to see is, let's look at the technology, maybe the skill that you're most interested in learning about and how much experience you have at it by account. So I'm going to bring in the skill level first. And then I want to see the amount of experience you have by that skill on the legend. And then let's just get a count of how many people are responding to each of those. Okay, so this will all fill in here in a few moments. I know it's blank right now. And then finally, just so that we have some total number of how many responses we have, I'm going to bring in a basic card visual here. And we're going to bring in just another count. So count of experience is fine. And we'll say total responses. Okay. All right, cool. So we have the report. Let's go ahead and save this report. And we'll call this my survey report. All right, now there's one caveat when it comes to working with streaming data sets. You can certainly look at the data from a report, but if you really want to see the results streaming in, you need to do that from a dashboard. So from a dashboard is the only mechanism that you could have for seeing those values streamed in. If I were to view this from the report, the only way I would actually see those new values come in is if I were to constantly hit the refresh button on the report itself. So if you want to be able to see those values streamed in, I need to create a dashboard and pin these visuals to that dashboard, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to hit pin here, and I'm going to create a new dashboard. Call this my survey dashboard. And hit pin. And I'm going to pin these other visuals to it as well. So I'll hit pin this one to the same dashboard. I'll pin these last 2, and then we are done with this section. And what we'll do next is we'll actually create the flow and talk about flow a little bit, because my assumption is there's probably quite a few of you on the line that have never actually used flow before. So I want to give you some context in why you would use flow before I go jump right into it. But right now, I should have a dashboard that has been created that has all these items pinned to it, like so. And it's looking pretty good. I think I'm pretty happy with that. So here's what I'm going to do next. The next thing I want to do is let's swing back over to my PowerPoint. Now that we have our dashboard created, we have a report created, and we have a streaming data set created, the last thing I want to do is actually create the flow that's going to feed into the streaming data set. So let's talk about flow for a few moments here. Let me switch back over to my slides here and talk a bit about flow. So if you're not too familiar with flow or you've never used it before, Microsoft Flow is a great tool for creating workflow automations. For any kind of repetitive tasks that you have that you want to automate, Microsoft Flow is a great tool for doing that. And basically how it works is you have some kind of a trigger that's going to kick off the flow, okay? So think about it like this. Let's say that you want to kick off a set of processes whenever a new row gets inserted into your database or into a SharePoint list or to an Excel file or whatever it may be. Or in my case, I want to generate or kick off a flow whenever somebody fills out a survey. You can do that. You can create a trigger within inside a flow that looks for an action to occur or waits for an action to occur. And when it does occur, it kicks off the flow. So a trigger is all about initiating the flow, and that can be based off of an event, like when a row arrives. It can be based off of a button. So you can actually have a app. There's a flow app that you can download on your phone, and you can push a button on your phone that initiates a flow. Or you can even buy a physical button. There's a company, a third-party company, that sells physical flow buttons so that whenever someone goes to push it, it initiates a flow as well. So it's kind of an IoT device to kick off a flow. Almost like if you've seen Amazon has those dash little buttons, or if you want to order some new Tide laundry detergent, you click a button and it just goes ahead and orders it for you. It's kind of the same idea. You can actually have that for flow triggers as well. And then lastly, there's also the ability to schedule flows. So if you want to schedule one, maybe every morning at 2 a.m., you want to kick off a set of processes, then you could use a flow trigger that's based off of a schedule. There's also some ones that are in preview right now that should be coming out of preview shortly, if not already. There was a lot of announcements that happened last week. But the one thing that's coming that's kind of interesting is they're doing some location-based triggers as well. So I could make it so that whenever my coworker gets within 50 yards of my office, that I automatically send them a text message that says, hey, bring me a coffee, and I need a coffee this morning. And I could have that set up so every morning when they get within inside of this geographical range of my office or wherever it may be, I can automatically trigger, have something sent to them. So that feature is coming, if not already here, that allows you to do some interesting location-based triggers as well. So you set up a trigger, and then the second step, which you may have multiple steps to, is you're going to create actions. And the actions just define whatever the process is that you want to occur. So in my case, my trigger is going to be when someone fills out my survey. So if someone fills out the survey as the trigger, and then my action is going to be load that data into Power BI. So your action there is to, what is the steps that you want to take after the trigger is initiated, okay? Now, again, if you're new to Flow, there's a lot of templates that you can use to get started. So if you're really not sure what can be done with Flow, take a look at the templates. There's thousands of them that you can pull from, and they'll give you some good ideas on what can be done. And the best way to do that is when you go to Microsoft Flow or flow.microsoft.com, you'll see that there is a search bar where you can just search for whatever the connector is that you want to work with. So if you're working with Salesforce, if you're working with Twitter, or you're working with SurveyMonkey, another example you see on the screen here, you can type in whatever the data connector is that you're working with, and it will give you all of the things that you can do to either pull data out of that data source, or all the things, I shouldn't say all the things, but many of the examples of what you can do to either pull data out of that data source or push data into that data source. So there's a lot of interesting things that you can do, and it does work with SQL Server. It does work with on-premises or cloud SQL Server. There's a lot of fun interactions that you can have, and it works with non-Microsoft data sources as well. All right, cool. So let's actually do this. But if you can, and this is the part I want you to participate with, if you could, go ahead and go to this link, or if you have your phone and you have a QR code scanner handy, go ahead and scan this. But if you could, this is the audience participation part, go to this link and just stop there for a minute. I don't want you to actually do the survey yet, or I don't want you to submit it yet, but go to the link and hang tight there, because this is the part that I'm going to have you participate in here in a few moments. So again, don't actually submit it yet, but go to the link, have the survey ready. I'm going to keep this on the screen for another 10 or 15 seconds. So if you go to that link and then just kind of be prepared and be ready, I'm going to have you do that survey in here in a few moments, and that's going to load into my Power BI streaming data set. And this is, if you're curious where I'm having to do this survey, it is a Microsoft product. It's called Microsoft Forms. And Forms is great for doing surveys. It's great for data collection. I happen to be using it for a survey here today, but you can use it for a lot of things if you're really interested in exploring Microsoft Flow. It's a free tool, or at least it's part of your Office 365 license, and I can actually send that survey to people without them having to log in. So I'm sending this survey to you, and it should not force you to log in or anything. I can send it to a lot of external users if I wanted to. right, so I had that up on the screen for long enough. Again, if you need it again, I'll pop it back up right before I have you do the survey. But the survey looks something like this. I'm going to ask you 3 questions. 1, which of the following skills are you most interested in learning about? So I have a few options in there. They're all kind of Power BI related, or you can just put other. Then I have a second option on the skill you selected. So on the skill above, which are you? What's your current experience level? So maybe you're new to DAX, so you're most interested in learning DAX, so you can select DAX and say you're a beginner on it, or maybe you're intermediate at DAX and you want to become an expert, you can select whatever. And then go ahead and put in whatever city, state, or city, province perhaps that you're from. So if I'm from Jacksonville, Florida, which I am, I can type that in and just leave that here. Don't hit submit yet. If you hit submit a little early, that's okay. You can do it again later, but hold out here. Don't click that yet because I'm going to have you do something else here in a few moments. All right, so here's what we're going to do next. Now, I actually want to bring in Microsoft Flow. And so I'm going to bring over flow.microsoft.com here. So you can go to this, by the way, if you're brand new to Flow, you likely already own Flow and just aren't using it. It is intermingled in with your Office 365 licensing. So the way licensing for Flow works is they do have some paid subscriptions for Flow that you can do, but the only reason why you might need to use those paid subscriptions is if you happen to use one of the data connectors that are more of a premium connector. So there's some connectors like Salesforce is a premium connector. On-premises SQL Server is a premium connector. So there might be a chance that you need to use it. The other thing to note when it comes to licensing with Flow is it's cumulative for all your users. The way that they license it is per number of executions of your flow. So if you have a flow that you've designed that gets executed thousands of times and you know you're only licensed for a certain number of executions, it's cumulative for all your users. So if you have a bunch of other users that are licensed for Flow but aren't using it, you can actually use their executions as part of your process. So it's nice how they do that, where you can say, hey, I got a bunch of other people that are Office 365 customers. I'm going to use, even though they don't know anything about Flow, you can actually use their executions as part of your process as well, the ones that they're paying for but not using. So here's what I want to do. Again, like I mentioned earlier, whenever you go into Flow, you can search for templates. So you can search for templates here. If I wanted to, I could search for, let's say, Microsoft Forms, and you'll be able to see a bunch of examples of how you can use forms. Or you can actually create your own flow to start off with. But the nice thing is the template option here allows you to see a lot of the ways that you can either connect to forms as a data source or send data into forms depending on what you're trying to do here. So in this case, it actually is using forms both as a source and destination here, but with an intermediate step. So a lot of fun stuff you can do here. Now in my case, because I want to teach you how to do this from the ground up, I'm actually not going to use a template. I'm going to go to create one from scratch. And so to do that, I'm going to go over to the left-hand side here where you see My Flows. And underneath My Flows, there's an option up on the top here where you can create a new flow. And we're going to create a new flow that's based off of a automated action, basically. So whenever a row gets inserted into my Microsoft form, or whenever a form is filled out, I want to initiate the execution of that form, of that flow, excuse me. So I'm going to go ahead and select automated from blank, and we'll give it a name, but let's go ahead and choose the trigger that we want. In this case, it's going to be based off of forms. Okay, and you can see when a new response is submitted, that's going to be our trigger. And then we're going to give the flow a name, of course. So let's call this our survey collection. So we're going to be collecting surveys here. And we're going to select our trigger is going to be when a new response is submitted to our flow. And we'll hit create. So this is going to create a new blank flow with our trigger up on the top already defined. We could have skipped that last step if we wanted to come here and define it here. We could have, but this actually makes it so that we can now build out our flow from scratch after the trigger has been defined. All right, so we're going to say when a new response is submitted to the form, so we're going to select the form that we created. And in my case, I created a form here. Let's see, it's loading in my forms here right now. One thing that you may notice as you work with Flow is sometimes it's a little delayed with picking up metadata. So you might find that in some cases you just need to save and close and reopen to get it to pick up the metadata that you're hoping for. Because right now it looks like it's kind of struggling to pick up the metadata here. So if that ever happens to you, oh, there it goes. It just took a while. If that ever happens to you, I recommend saving and then exiting and coming back into it, because sometimes the metadata gets a little bungled up and it's just needs some time to refresh here. But I have here a form called Pass BA Virtual User Group that I'm going to select. And then we're going to add in new steps underneath that. So we're saying anytime a new value is entered into that form, that we want to kick off a few other steps here. And the other steps that we want to add in here, we're going to add in a new step. And this new step is also going to come from Microsoft Forms. And what we would like to do is we want to get the responses from the form. So I want to get response details from the form that we've selected. So I'll select get response details here. And then we're going to pass in which form it is that we want to get responses from. So from the previous step, you can find here the Pass BA Virtual User Group here again. And then we're going to pass in here what response ID that we want to basically iterate over. So what's going to happen here is it's going to pull back a list of all the responses to our survey, and then it's going to loop over each one of the values for you. I'm not sure how many folks on the phone come from a background where they've done things like SSIS in your background, or maybe even data factory, excuse me. But you may, in some cases, want to figure out how to actually loop over or iterate over a set of values. Flow has the capability of doing that, and a lot of what it'll do it'll actually automate the creation of those for loops for you. So in my case here, where I'm going to loop over each instance of a survey response, I can tell it to feed in the list of all the survey notifications here. And when I do that, you'll notice it automatically creates this apply to each loop for me. I didn't have to do anything to make that happen other than to tell it to get the responses and to tell it that I want to iterate over each the list of responses that I have. All right, final step here is the Power BI step. So we're going to add another action. And the final action that we're going to add in here is all around Power BI. So I'm going to search for the Power BI actions that we have available to us. And what I'd like to do is I want to add a row to a data set. So we have a Power BI data set that I want to feed into. So I'm going to select that I want to add rows to a data set. We're going to select the workspace that I want to connect to, which in our case is going to be, I think I called it Pass something here. Yep, Pass BA Virtual Group. We're going to tell it the name of the data set that we want to feed into. So the name of our data set is called Streaming Survey. That's what we created in the very beginning part of our demo. And then the final step here, the table option is always going to be the same name. I never gave it a name for the table because it's actually going to define the name of the table for me automatically. So when I actually select from the list of table names, you'll see there's only one available for me for that data set. It's called real-time data. So if I select that, it's then going to populate these columns that we defined a few moments ago. So in the very beginning of our demo, when we were in Power BI, I told it that I had 3 columns, one defining what the skill is, one defining the experience, and one defining the location. And now I'm going to be tying together my Power BI data set to my flow responses. All right, so what we'll do is if you select the skill section here, you'll see you have an option here to add dynamic content, which is on the right-hand side. And on the right-hand side, you can actually pick from the responses or from the questions that were part of your survey, and you can pass those values of the responses to those questions into your Power BI data set. And by the way, I'm using Microsoft Forms as the data source here, but you could use really anything as the data source to feed into Power BI if you wanted to. All right, so what I want to do is I want to load in a couple of the things here. Let's see what we got. I want to load in which of the following skills are you most interested in is going to feed into my skill column. For my experience column, I'm going to feed in on the skill you selected, what's your experience? I'm going to select that one. And then for the location, we'll obviously select the location column that I had. Let's see, where are you from? Right here. All right, so let's try that. So if I've now defined that, I can save this flow like so. So the save button is in the top right here whenever you're ready. And once you've completed that, you should be able to now leave Flow, and I can have you guys start to do the survey. So here's what I'd like you to do. If you have that survey still open, hopefully you do, and I'll bring up the URL for it here again if you came in late. But if you haven't already, go ahead and go to that survey and then start to fill it out. And what I'd hope to see is in our Power BI survey, there we go, I'm starting to get some responses. So I have one person from Dallas, Texas, one response so far. Oh, there's a bunch more responses starting to feed in now. So I have 17 responses so far out of our group, and I'm starting to see all these come in here. So a lot of folks in the States here, but we got some others in the UK as well as Ireland. So we got quite a bit going on here. Iceland. Wow, way off. So pretty cool stuff, right? So what this shows you is I'm able to now feed in results from live fed in data. And you might even be able to spot yourself here. I didn't ask for your name, but you can probably tell by the city that you happen to type in whether it's you or not. And I can see what kind of things that you're most interested in. So Michael, you may want to take notes for next sessions here. So data visualization tips and tricks is a very popular topic. Data shaping kind of second. DAX, I'm surprised DAX is a little further down. And then only one person had something for other. But it's pretty interesting here. I can now see what's most interesting to you. And by the way, if you want to do that survey more than once, just to kind of see how many surveys we can get plugged in here and how I can stream those results in, feel free to do it a second time. There's no limit to how many times you can do it. I could put a limit on it, but I didn't. And we'll see more and more results kind of feed in here. So the idea here, though, is we happen to use Flow as a data source, Forms as a data source. But the really neat thing about how Microsoft Flow works is you have up to 230 different data connectors that you can use as a source that you can then pull in data from and then feed into Power BI in the streaming data set type that we're seeing here. And so we're seeing even more surveys come through. You guys are doing a good job filling that up for me. We have a high participation unless people are doing it more than once, which is great. If you did, that's fine. But it gives you some really cool way to be able to kind of intermingle these different tools together. And this isn't the only way. So what I want to show you next, and you're welcome to keep doing the survey if you'd like. I'll look at some of the results later. But what I want to show you next is just another way that you can intermingle Flow with Power BI. And it's going to be another streaming data set, but I want to show you something else and how we can intermingle a few other of the capabilities within inside Flow to bring that capability into Power BI. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go, thank you for doing the survey. You guys can stop that. But here's what I'm going to do next. I'm going to create a second streaming data set. So we're going to do a second example here. And what we're going to do with the second example is I'm going to go back to almost like that example that we mentioned earlier around a brand that really is interested in tracking the social media sentiment that they have. So let's say I work for Microsoft and I want to be able to track how people feel about our company. Do they feel positively or negatively about our company? I want to be able to track that information in a streaming data set, send it into Power BI, because again, like I mentioned earlier, the idea of the streaming data set is I want to be able to react very quickly to it, especially in a social media environment where if I don't react quickly and something sits there for hours and someone's maybe complaining about our company and I don't react to it in a hopefully a very consumer friendly way, then I'll be seen even more negatively. Probably a great use case for this is airlines, right? Whenever someone has a problem with an airline, you guarantee they're going to go tweet about it probably to make sure others know that they're unsatisfied with something. And in many cases, those airlines will actually respond to those social media interactions. So what I'd like to do is I want to be able to filter down that social media interaction to just the ones that are negative or positive, so that way I can respond to it. If there's not really any negative or positive reaction in the tweets, then I could kind of shovel those off. I'm less interested in those. I just want to be able to respond to either positive or negative ones. So what we're going to do in this example is I'm going to create a second streaming data set. So this is back into Power BI again. This is going to be connecting to an API again, a push data set. And we are going to track data historically like we did the first time, so make sure we turn that on. And in this example, what we're going to do is we're going to be looking at Twitter data. So I'm going to call this my tweet or Twitter data collection. All right, and then the data set's going to be a little different. In this case, we're going to be pulling in the name of the user, which will be text. We're going to be pulling in the tweet text itself. So what did they write, which is also text. We're going to pull in the tweet date. So when was it posted, which is a date time here. You'll see the data types are pretty limited here. You can have text, number, or date time. That's just a streaming data set limit. And then finally, what I'd like to do here is I'm going to bring in a final column that is the score. I want to score these values and actually rate them for how positive or negative they are. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to leverage Azure Cognitive Services to be able to actually do some text analysis and analyze the sentiment of that text that's being brought in. By the way, another way, there's a lot of ways you can play around with cognitive services inside of Flow. You could do things like actually analyze images and return back what an image is. So if you take a picture of a person standing next to a desk, it might say woman standing next to desk. You can actually return back text like that using Flow. You can also do things like text translation. So let's say, for example, I run a company that makes a software product, and I want to be able to handle all these incoming emails that might be in multiple languages and translate them into a language that I can understand and then email them back something appropriate. Well, you can also use cognitive services to detect the language of the emails that are coming into your inbox and then translate them to whatever your language may be based on the text detection, the language detection that's built into cognitive services as well. So what we're going to do is I'm going to take a score, a numeric score. It's going to output to give me social media sentiment. And if it's anything that's greater than 0.5, then I'm going to say it's positive. If it's anything less than 0.5, then it's negative. And if it's exactly 0.5, that means it's kind of neutral, and I care about it far less. So I'll go ahead and create this data set. And then I'm going to do what we did last time is I'm going to build a report and dashboard off of that data set. That way, it'll be more interesting as we actually see the data streaming in. So I'm going to go ahead and create a quick report here off that Twitter data. And you know what? I'm even going to bring in a custom visual just to make this a little interesting here. I'm going to bring in a custom visual from the marketplace. And the one that I like to use for this example is the circle KPI. So let's just search for circle here. So I'm going to bring in the circle KPI gauge and add that in. And I'll bring that in. And what I want to do is I want to see the score, the average score. Let me make sure I do an average of that. I want to see the average score for each of these tweets. I also want to see a count of the tweets coming in. So let's bring in a count, and I can really do that based off any one of these fields. I'm not going to do a count distinct. I'm just going to do a regular count here. And then let's bring in a few other things. Maybe I want to see a timeline of how these tweets are actually being entered in. So I'll bring in maybe an area chart here. And in the area chart here, let's bring in the date. And I'd like to see the average score of those tweets by date. We can actually, you know what, let's just do a count again. Let's bring in a count. There we go. And then finally, let's bring in a table just so we can see the outright data being brought in here without any special visual on it other than a table here. So I'm going to bring in and look at the user, the text, the date, and the score here. Okay. All right, cool. So I'll increase the font size of that so it's a little easier to see. Okay. Perfect. And then just like we did last time, so remember what we did last time whenever we did this is we not only had to create this report and save the report, but we also needed to pin these items to the dashboard. The reason for that is if you're going to stream data into your Power BI solutions, you can't stream data into the reports. You can only stream them into dashboards. In fact, if he had gone to look at my survey report earlier, it would show the data as blank until I actually click the refresh button. So streaming data sets are only allowed from the dashboard itself. That's just how it functions right now. All right, so this is going to be my Twitter report, and I'll save that. Okay, give that a second to save. Okay, looks like it's saved over here. And then next, I'll actually pin these to a dashboard. So I'll create another new dashboard here. Oh, I thought I already did that. Let's try it again. Okay. Thought I did that once already. Oh, I did it twice now. All right, so we'll go ahead and create a dashboard. We'll call this our Twitter dashboard. Oh, it looks like it's actually saving it multiple times there. That's okay. I probably have several. Yeah, I have 3 separate reports now. Oh, well, that's okay. So I'm going to create this, I'll call this my Twitter dashboard now and pin this. And then we're going to pin all of these other visuals to that dashboard as well. So we're going to pin this to our Twitter dashboard. We're going to pin this to our Twitter dashboard. And finally, our table, we will do the same thing here. Okay, here we go. And then once we have this completed, we're going to then go back over to Flow and create a second flow for being able to monitor that. So I'm going to bring open my Twitter dashboard and just kind of keep this here so we can look at it. But while we're doing that, I'm going to go back over to Flow And by the way, if you want to see all the executions of our flow earlier, you can look at the run history. Here's all the executions of our flow from our first example we did. So our first example here for our survey collection, if you select it, you'll actually be able to see all the executions for those flows here just a few moments ago. And I have thousands of flow executions that I can use that are part of my subscriptions. And like I mentioned earlier, you can actually, even if you wanted to, not if you wanted to, it just does this, you can get a cumulative of all of the executions that are available within inside of your organization are available to you as well. All right. So my next example here, what we're going to do, we're going to create another flow. We're going to create another flow that's going to be an automated one. And in this case, we're going to be pulling data from Twitter. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and select that we want to pull, we'll call this our Twitter collection, Twitter data collection. And then we're going to make our trigger is going to be Twitter. Okay, so when a new tweet is posted, we'll select that and hit create. And it's going to create a new flow for us. And then we can identify what are the, say for example, hashtags that we want to monitor within inside of this flow. So if our brand is Microsoft and we're trying to monitor Microsoft's Twitter analytics, then we could put in Microsoft as the hashtag we want to monitor, or we could do others. We could have in here, you know, we want to monitor Power BI. Maybe we want to monitor, let's do one other here. Let's do Excel, something like that. So I can monitor multiple hashtags if I wanted to. You can monitor accounts. You can do whatever you'd like here. Then I'm going to add another new step here. And this next step, what it's going to do is it's going to tap into cognitive services to be able to do some sentiment detection. And so in this one, what we're going to do is we're going to search for detect sentiment. Okay, give that a second. And you can see below, you have some options here for doing text analysis and actually detecting sentiment. You can also detect language, you can detect faces. All these things tap into cognitive services inside of Azure. In our case, I'm going to use this detect sentiment one here. It's a text analysis option. And what I'd like to do is I'm going to pass in the field that has the tweet text from our previous step into Azure. And so for our text that we want to analyze, I'm going to pass in the tweet text. So on the right-hand side, you can see the dynamic columns that are available to you. This dynamic content comes from anything that has happened upstream from the step that we happen to be looking at right now. So I could type in something like, I think it's tweet text. Yep, there it is, tweet text. So I want to analyze this value that comes through from my source, and I want to do some detecting of the sentiment. So is it positive or negative feelings that people have about it? You'll also need to identify what the language is. So if I want to go ahead and hard code this to English, I can, or I could have had a step before this where I actually determined what the language was and then passed in the language using the dynamic content option here as well. So you'll see the enter custom value. That would allow you to actually have dynamically what did you detect the language was before you attempted to analyze it. All right. Cool. So then our last step is we want to push this data into Power BI. Now, there's some extra stuff we can talk about if we have extra time on the cognitive services piece, how to get that set up. I happen to actually already have some of that set up here. You can see I have a sentiment analysis connection already defined. There was a little bit of work to get that set up. It's not hard though. You would actually go into your Azure portal and create a cognitive services resource. And then you would pull back the API key from it, and you would also pull back the endpoint from it to get a connection set up for it. And we can talk more about that if we have a little extra time, but we're kind of running short on time here. So my last step inside of Flow is we're going to create almost like a destination to Power BI like we did in our last example. You'll notice this one doesn't require any looping like our first example did, because we're not really going over an array. We're not having a loop over an array. We're just saying take each of the Twitter values as they come in and feed them straight into Power BI as you analyze the sentiment of them. So our last action here that we're going to do then is going to be a Power BI action. And we're going to tell it that we want to add rows to a data set. And this is going to be very similar to the example we did with our survey data. And in this case, though, we're going to send this into our workspace, same workspace we had earlier called Past BA Virtual Group. I'm then going to point it to the data set called Twitter Data Collection. And then if you remember right from our previous example, the table name is always going to be the same. And so in our case here, the table name is real-time data. It's always going to be that if you're working with a streaming data set like this. Then once you select the data set, it's going to feed in which columns are you going to pass in values to from your Twitter source or from your text analysis. And so what I'm going to do in this case is I'm going to pass in the user is all going to be dynamic content. So you'll see the dynamic content on the right-hand side, and I can pass in things like the user. So I can pass in the username here. Let me unzoom here for a moment so I can see this a little better. So the username there should be a username column in here. Let's see, username. There it is. There's a username column we're going to pass in. There's one called tweet text that we can pass in right here. There's also one that's, I think, a created date or created at. And then finally, there is our score. Now, the score is going to come from a different source. It's actually going to come from our detect sentiment section here. So even any of these little sections that you see broken out, those are different sources that they're coming from within the flow itself. So detect sentiment is pointing to the step that we have right above here. The one that we have a little lower, when a new tweet is posted, that's coming from our trigger at the very top. But we're going to use, in this case, the score to be able to pass into our Power BI data set. So you can have things come from multiple locations within the flow that all feed into our data set. And then once we're done with that, we'll hit save. And we should start to see, after a few moments, let me make sure that finishes saving. After a few moments, we'll start to see tweets that get passed into our Power BI data set. Now, one thing to note about the Twitter trigger is it doesn't quite do everything instantaneously with Twitter. With Twitter, things often take, I think it's about a minute. Every minute it pulls Twitter to see if any of those tweets occurred. So if we wait a few seconds here, you'll actually see some of the tweets start to come through for that data set that we happen to pull from, or from those hashtags we happen to select. Again, Twitter's a little unique. It's a little bit different than the Microsoft Forms example I showed earlier. With Microsoft Forms, as you were entering in values into my survey, we saw the results come through immediately. With Twitter, it does some polling. Every 1 minute, it's going to go check and see if there's values that match our hashtags that we did. And assuming I did my flow correctly, we should start to see some of those results come through here pretty soon. So let me check and make sure my flow is executing. Okay, one way I can do that is kind of refresh this, see all the runs. Okay, it looks like it's running right now. Oh, here it comes. So here's some of my tweets starting to come through. I've collected 44 tweets already. You can see what time those tweets occurred. You can also see here, if I had this a little larger, all of the individual tweets that come through. So there's a lot of them that mention Microsoft, of course. That was one of the hashtags I'm monitoring. You'll see some of them mention Power BI, a lot of them mentioning Azure here. There we go. And I can kind of look at those individually. Now, if you remember what I mentioned earlier, I mentioned that you can only really stream these results through Power BI dashboards. If I were to go to look at the underlying report here, so if I go look at the report just by selecting one of these values, it'll take me to the underlying report. You'll notice here that everything shows up as blank initially. It kind of even flashed there for a moment where it was showing values, but it went away. That's again because you can't stream results into reports. If you want to have streaming data sets, you got to do it through dashboards. It doesn't mean I can't use the report. It just means if I want to see those results, I got to click the refresh option up here in the top. And when I click that refresh option, after I do that, you'll see the results come through. So now I can see 101 and I can see the results here. But anytime I want to see new results come through, I'm going to need to actually hit the refresh button. The dashboard does allow me to stream values, but not from the reports. And so I can see mostly positive tweets about Microsoft. Maybe that's not too surprising for you, but anything that's above 50% is positive. Anything lower than 50% is negative. If it's at 50%, then it's kind of neutral. And so I can look at the individual tweets here to see how positive or negative they were. And if I find the one that's particularly positive, then I can kind of look at that one individually if I wanted to. So pretty interesting stuff here. So Michael, I think that's it I have as far as new content that I want to cover. I know we only have roughly 4 or 5 minutes left here. Do you have any questions here that are ready to, or queued up to be asked?
Yep, we got a few. First is from Cormac. Cormac wants to know the rate for the push data set is 1 request per second. What happens if updates are coming faster than that? Are they dropped?
Good question. Yeah, they aren't dropped. So it would just wait. It would kind of queue that until the next polling. So you actually see that with the Twitter example here. So Twitter waits to poll every 1 minute in this case. So it would kind of queue them all up, those that occurred within the last minute, and then it would pull them from that point going forward. Yeah, it's a good question.
Cool. Sandeep would like to know, where are the data sets saved?
Yeah, so good question. It saves it in a database, but it's in a database that or is not really for human consumption. I can't go in and actually start to interact with it. I can't connect to it separately within Power BI. So it is a Power BI data set. And one trick that you could do potentially is you could connect to the data sets within inside of Power BI desktop. But if you go to connect to it with inside Power BI desktop, you lose all the modeling capability. You can just kind of build a report on top of it. But keep in mind, you kind of lose that streaming capabilities. And by the way, I'm not sure how many of you have actually seen some of the updates here with Power BI, but you're seeing, the nice color change. They have the certified datasets thing that's coming out here shortly. But here I could, if I wanted to, just briefly, let me show this. What was the name of our dataset? It was Twitter. Here we go. Twitter data collection. I could select this one, and then if I connect to this one, you'll notice that all of the modeling capability goes away, like so, and I can just build some reports off of it. Again, the downside here is nothing's going to be streaming from the report side. I have to put it in the dashboard.
Cool. Slightly related to that, Cormac said, asked, how can you capture the data from a streaming data set and store it somewhere else for further historical analysis?
Yeah, it's a great question. So you would have to use a non-Power BI tool. So for Power BI, when you're using streaming data sets, it does store it in a database in the backend, but it's not going to be anything that you can actually connect directly to. So you could use API connections in tools like Azure Data Factory or SSIS to be able to pull data in and store it really in any location you want. When you're using streaming data sets within Power BI, there's only one destination possible, and it's not going to allow you to actually go point it to something else, unfortunately. But yeah, good question.
Could we, so like in Flow, could we perhaps redirect it from Flow?
Yeah, you could. Yeah, so absolutely. So in my Flow data set, I could have sent it to a SharePoint list, a SQL database. Absolutely. That's a great point. I could have, with inside of Flow, rather than sending it to Power BI, I could have just replaced what ended up being a destination here with anything else I wanted to. Great point.
Great. Okay, David would like to know, are there any other forms that are not MS, MS forms based that can trigger a flow?
Yeah, there's a lot of good stuff. So you could use, it does allow you to connect into things like Google Sheets. So if you have anything that's kind of feeding into a Google Sheet, you could certainly use that as a data source. I would encourage you to check out the templates with Inside Flow. So with Inside Flow, you'll find that they're trying to make the tool more of a consumer product or as close to a consumer/business product as possible. There are some other consumer products on the market that are very similar, but they don't tap into as many business products. Like there's one called If This Then That. It's let me make sure I get the acronym right here. Is if this, there it is. If This Then That, ifttt.com. And that's a more of a consumer-ready product that does a lot of the same things, but it does not, as far as I remember, and the last time I checked, it doesn't tap into things like Power BI. It can tap into a lot of consumer products like Alexa and your Outlook calendar and things like that. But for more business-ready consumption, then you'll look at things like Flow, or if your company is looking to do this more as an enterprise tool, you may even look at Azure Logic Apps. So if you're not familiar with Azure Logic Apps, it's essentially the same thing as Flow, but just more enterprise ready, and that would be more of the IT tool that your IT staff would use. It's licensed a little bit differently. It's within Azure, but it has a little bit more capabilities, but you're going to see over time they're trying to get very close to feature parity of Flow to Logic Apps.
Great. Nihal would like to know, is it possible to pin the entire page or to pin the entire report onto the dashboard, or as opposed to just the individual report items?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can pin a live page. Now it's not going to, I don't think it's going to do what you think it's going to do. If I hit pin live page, I can pin the entire page to the dashboard if I want, but it's not going to kind of stream in updates, which I think is probably what you're looking for. So if I go down to the bottom here, you'll see it's stuck at 101 tweets as the last count, whereas my other one is at 115. So if you want to get the stream, and I basically, by the way, I turned off the flow, so we're not getting any more in here. If you want to get the streaming values in, then you have to do them as kind of regular dashboard tiles. But just to show you one more time, in case that was a new feature for you, if you want to pin an entire report, you'll see there's an option up in the top here where you can pin a live report, and that takes the entire content of the report to the dashboard. And it keeps the dashboard interactive, but when it comes to streaming data sets, it's not going to stream in any new values.
Cool. Kayla, actually, she actually just asked exactly what you asked. You just answered. Is there a way to turn off the flow, for example, the Twitter dashboard?
Yeah, great question. So let me show how I actually did that. I kind of did it without saying anything. So if I go back to my flows, within inside of my flows, you can see these are turned off. They have these little, well, let me zoom in. They have these little kind of X's through them. The way I did that is if you actually click on the flow, you'll see up in the top right-hand corner, you have kind of a turn on or turn off option. So that way you can disable it so it's not constantly running and eating up the resources that you have for flow.
Great. 2 more questions. Jose noticed that the time coming in was 5:30 p.m. He wants to know what time zone is being used.
Yeah, so in this case, it's based off of the tenant that I have assigned to me for would be Flow in this case. So I might have my environment in Flow. So they use this concept within Flow and Power Apps called environments. It's kind of like workspaces, but not really. It's basically, you would think of environments as almost like a dev test production is one way of using it. There's other ways you can work with them too, but it's based on wherever my environment's hosted. So if you think of Azure, Azure has where you can have different data centers selected. So I might have my Flow tenant and a more unusual data set. It would appear in this case. I might have it pulling from somewhere else.
Cool. Kayla would just like to know, is it possible to stack multiple sort of flows together? For example, sending data to both Power BI and Excel at the same time?
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Creating like a multicast if we think SSIS kind of.
Oh, Michael, you're my man. You speak more SSIS to me. I love it. Yeah, so you can actually insert new steps. So you can have parallel branches here. So I think this is kind of addressing that question. If I wanted to, I could add a separate branch. And so that way I can have sending into Power BI, but also sending into a SharePoint list or sending into a SQL database. And I can have both of those occurring at the same time. So let me show how I did that one more time, because I kind of did it a little fast there. If you go look within inside of your flow, oops, sorry. If you go look within inside of your flow, there's an option here where you can add in a step, and you can kind of inject a step in between, my steps that I already have. And I can add a parallel branch here where things can actually execute in parallel if I'd like. You can also do, one of the other things you can do with inside Flow that's kind of interesting is you can do approvals. So if I wanted to, let's say before I go to load this record into my SQL database, I want to give it a quick look and approve that it comes through and meets my standards. They have this concept of approvals built into Flow as well, where you can have people approve or check out values prior to you actually inserting it into your database. So that's kind of a neat functionality that you have here as well. Flow, by the way, is kind of, yeah, I'd say it's a replacement. It's a replacement for SharePoint flows. So you're seeing a lot of people that are really already up with how Flow and Power Apps works. A lot of those people are coming from more of a SharePoint background because both Power Apps and Flow are replacing a couple tools that you have within inside of SharePoint. So SharePoint had their own SharePoint workflows that this is replacing and does a much better job, I think. And then Power Apps is kind of replacing like InfoPath. So if you had folks that did InfoPath in the past in SharePoint, Power Apps is a much, I'll go ahead and say it, a much sexier replacement for InfoPath.
All right. Okay. Last question. Dave would like to know, how does Flow compare to Node-RED, if you've ever heard of that?
What is it called again? I don't think I have. Say it one more time.
Node-RED.
Node-RED. I have not heard of that one before. So yeah, I wouldn't be able to. I'll be honest with you, at least when I haven't heard of it. If you're looking at other tools, so I gave you one example that it compares to. There's if this then that. There's Flow, of course, and then there's one other more consumer level tool that I've heard of. I'm trying to remember the name, but there are several. Zapier. Zapier is actually not so much consumer level. Zapier, I'd say, is more enterprise, third-party kind of tool. So Zapier is another one. So it's another good tool. So a lot of companies use this for being able to push data in and out of Salesforce or your own internal database. It's a good tool. Actually, I like all three of these tools. I happen to like Microsoft Flow a little better because it interconnects in with a lot of the things that I'm already doing with Office 365 and Power BI and Power Apps and Flow and SharePoint and Excel and all those things that you do on a regular basis. The interconnectivity with Microsoft Flow is stellar. It's really good. But these other ones aren't bad. So it's worth checking out Zapier. It's worth checking out If This Then That. I would say of these, If This Then That is probably they do have a business version, but it's probably the more consumer level kind of thing. So I actually use If This Then That to send myself a reminder to take out the trash every Wednesday night kind of thing. So you can do stuff like that. This makes it a little fun.
Great. Thanks so much, Devin. I think we've all learned lots. It's always interesting to see how easy the stuff is getting. But yeah, I think if nobody else has any more questions, then we want to thank you for your time, and we'll let everybody get back to the office.
All right. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Thanks a lot. Cheers.
Take care. Bye.